Our story begins more than 60 years ago inside an abandoned chicken coop, where our founder discovered a retired teacher living, no home, no health care. So she said no to this injustice and yes to transforming lives. It's this drive, this compassion, that inspired AARP. Today, we empower people to choose how they live as they age. As a wise friend and fierce defender, we advocate for better health, financial security, and stronger communities. AARP, join us in making a difference.
Hello, good day. I'm glad to be here to share with you some information on how to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion into your workplace, into your organization. My name is Edna Kane-Williams. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer here at AARP, and I'm delighted again to be here in this program sponsored by the Colorado Center for Aging. Next slide, please. Now, what I'd like to talk about today is basically AARP's approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've been in this space for a while, probably more than 20 years. But my office that I'm currently leading, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, really was first launched last year. And so this is sort of a new iteration, a new really transformation of our multicultural work here at AARP. And why is it important? It's important for a number of reasons. We here at AARP are focused on eliminating disparities, and I'll talk more about that later. Talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in a way that elevates everyone. I actually think this is a key point because often I hear diversity, equity, and inclusion criticized because people feel left out of the conversation. So here at AARP, diversity by its very nature really should embrace and involve everyone, all races, all sexual genders, orientation, religion, political preferences, etc. It really is something that should work to elevate everyone. It's a moral imperative. Increasingly, these are trying times, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the racial unrest, frankly, and strife that we see happening in the country today. People are not listening and not appreciating different viewpoints. But I hope that we can all appreciate and agree that diversity, equity, and inclusion, those three words are tenets to live by. They represent model behavior that we want for people and for organizations. And then lastly, and I don't like to emphasize this, but it also, diversity, equity, and inclusion also has proven through research at business schools and other research centers throughout the country to be good for business. That organizations and for-profit organizations in particular that practice good diversity, equity, and inclusion, their stock prices tend to be higher, their teams perform better, etc. So it is important work, it's compelling work, and it's work that we all need to be about now. Next slide, please. This I mentioned in the previous slide that it's also a business imperative. And this, I won't go into it very detailed, but looking at the likelihood of financial outperformance, those organizations that have both gender diversity and ethnic diversity, looking at the light blue bars, all do better, and better by significant and substantial numbers, as determined by McKinsey in a study they did in 2020. So again, I think of the four reasons to do diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm not positing that the business imperative is the most important, but often people want to see what's the return on the investment for different social initiatives. That's been proven for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide, please. A little bit about defining the three words. I won't read these here. But it is important to understand that we use diversity, equity, and inclusion intentionally. They mean different things. They shouldn't be used interchangeably. They really cover different aspects of the DEI spectrum. And we take time to show these definitions because, again, when you start using acronyms like DEI or DENI, I find that it sometimes loses its power, that people don't focus as much on what the words are and what the words mean. So diversity, differences among people, a variety of dimensions. Diversity is often thought of as just about race. It's not just about race, it's about age as well, which is something that AARP really likes to emphasize, being an organization about aging. It's about gender, it's about sexual orientation, it's about religion, it's about disability, and about 18 other things, because I said even political persuasion, whether you live in the suburbs or whether you live in a city or whether you live in a rural area, there's all types of diversity, and we should think of it as expansively as possible. Equity talks about fair and even treatment, access and opportunity and advancement for all people. And inclusion is the achievement of, especially a work environment where all individuals are treated fairly and respectably and have equal access to leadership opportunities and resources. Next slide, please. I mentioned that now is really the time, in my opinion, to focus on DE&I. In many ways, we're having a crisis of health and wellness. Can you believe it? This is our going into almost our third year of living with the COVID pandemic. What that has meant for us in terms of our day-to-day lives and our families, our livelihoods, and really the education of our children and how children are being raised. I think this pandemic will be, the implications we'll be feeling for years to come. So that's definitely one, and across the diversity and the DE&I spectrum, people are experiencing it differently. COVID definitely has impacted Black and Brown communities differently than other communities. Access to health and health care has been different. Access to the vaccines and to the newest modalities of treating COVID. So there's a lot that we've had to deal with in terms of the health and wellness space in the last several years. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a lot almost daily happening around race relations in this country and indeed in the world that have, I don't know about you, but sometimes I shake my head and think, is this 2022 or is it 1962? It feels very deja vu in some ways, that we're reliving some aspects of our past in terms of the struggles we're having in talking about race, in dealing with each other about race, in levels of acceptance and how we deal with differences. So that's impacting the DE&I conversation. And then I don't call it a crisis of aging, actually, the wording be changed. But certainly there are changes in terms of aging. This is the first time in the United States history, for example, that we have a 5-generation workplace. We have the silent generation, boomers, millennials, Gen X, and Gen Z all working in organizations at the same time. Tremendous challenge, tremendous opportunity for sure, but a tremendous challenge. And we have a longevity economy, meaning that people are living longer. We see trends in health that some of us, not all of us, are living healthier longer. All of these trends in terms of health, wellness, disease, aging, race relations, create a dynamic environment where really now is the time to really focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion to help us navigate all of these major, major changes that are going on in the world. Next slide, please. So I like to talk about the 6 components to centering DE&I in our work. And when I say our work, I mean your work as well. DE&I, as I said, I almost regret that it's an acronym right now. It easily rolls off the tongue. But in order to do this work well and to show up in this space well, there are some ingredients that need to be stirred in a pot. One is having measurable goals and objectives. This is not a Pollyannish endeavor. This is not a nice to do. This is not feel good. This is really, as we talked about before, it's both a moral and business imperative, but you have to have measurable goals and objectives in order within an organization to be able to demonstrate how you're making progress, how you're using resources, what your measure of success is, when indeed you feel like you'll reach that pinnacle of success. The best DEI efforts have executive support, starting from the very top of the organization, including the CEO and the board. I'm very pleased at AARP that I report directly to our Chief Executive Officer, Joanne Jenkins, and that our board is very focused on DE&I. DE&I requires long-term commitment. It sounds trite, but it's a marathon, not a sprint. It takes years. And in fact, as I said earlier, and I've been doing this work for decades, it seems like, and yet I would never have imagined that we'd be at this point in 2022 where we still have such a long way to go. So it really does require organizations to have a commitment for the long term. Don't get into DE&I work thinking this is something that you can resolve or do in a couple of years. That's not going to happen. It takes collective responsibility throughout an organization, meaning that while I run the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for AARP, it's not just my small team's responsibility to make sure that AARP shows up. We really talk a lot throughout the enterprise about what everyone can do, from our research department to our state and national communities department, our state offices, such as the one in Colorado, our advocacy work, our brand work, our media work. Everyone needs to be focused on what diversity, equity, and inclusion means for that department. And ideally, you have an organizational plan that everybody is driven towards and understands and is trying to align with. You do need the allocation of sufficient resources. DE&I work is not necessarily inexpensive work. You need to commit both people and dollars to get this done. The outcomes are better when the efforts are well resourced. And then finally, and this, I include age inclusion because we've done some studies that show that ironically, many organizations that have DE&I departments do not include aging as an area of focus. So AARP, when we talk to organizations about being a model organization, we specifically call out the inclusion of age as one of those determinants of diversity. Look at your workforce, look at your customer base, look at how you are fostering a multi-generational, intergenerational workforce. Yes, we're and marketplace. We're AARP, but we're not just focused on people over the age of 50. When we say age inclusion, we mean across the board: millennials, Gen Z, Gen X, silent generation, baby boomers. Everyone should have equal access to training, to resources, to opportunities within the marketplace and the workplace. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about what we've been able to do at AARP in the last year and a half that we've had our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And first, a little bit about our mission. And probably not surprisingly, we are committed to upholding equality and equity, both in the workplace, in our workforce, and in the marketplace. We support efforts to expand the diversity of AARP's membership. Very pleased to say that we have almost 4 million African American members, 2 million Hispanic Latino members, about 1 million AAPI members, about almost 1 million self-reported LGBTQ members, and about 800,000 American Indian and Native Alaskan members. But those numbers aren't enough. We're always trying to increase them. And so we have a variety of efforts that we've launched to increase that membership. We want to remove any impediments that exist. We want to address disparities and systemic factors that impact these communities. We want to support efforts to educate, inform, and deepen the consciousness of our staff, volunteers, members, and partners. And then finally, foster an open workplace culture grounded in continuous learning. Continuous learning, so important. Training is so important. in the space of DE&I. It really does need to happen all the time, not just once, because there's always something popping on the horizon that we need to better understand. Next slide, please. The work at AARP in terms of our strategic priorities around DE&I focus on our social mission. And this is a quote from our founder, Ethel Percy Andrus: "What we do for one, we do for all," meaning it's regardless of membership status. We don't ask people to show a membership card before we share information about Social Security or, excuse me, Medicare or COVID. And we did a lot of COVID outreach in terms of educating about both the virus and vaccine availability, making sure people had the decisions to make decisions for themselves. We weren't trying to make the decision for people. We wanted to make sure that people had the decisions, the information that they needed. And that happened regardless of membership status. But we are also very focused on growing, as I mentioned, our multicultural membership. And as I mentioned also, we want to do everything that we can to address age inclusion challenges and age discrimination in particular that's faced by individuals. And we think by doing this, will help AARP grow into a model DE&I organization. I promised our CEO when I took this job that I wanted AARP to be a model organization in the space. So the 6 steps that I talked about earlier, along with these strategic priorities, I think will definitely help us get there. Next slide, please. Now a little bit, and I'm closing in a little bit, but about our progress in terms of helping AARP be a model DE&I organization. One, as I mentioned, we are championed by the CEO and the board. I report directly to the CEO and actually provide updates to the board at every board meeting. As the CDO, as the Chief Diversity Officer, I'm on the executive team of AARP, a team of 10 people that work with the CEO to help guide the organization. I have a 18-person staff, core staff, that helps us with our outreach to diverse audiences, helps us with our age inclusion and internal facing capacities. We have executive team members that all have performance goals that relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we found that that's a key tenet of model organizations, that they hold people responsible in their performance goals for DE&I. We have 8 employee resource groups, which many model DE&I organizations have. That those are entities that are volunteer employee run, that help employees get involved in DE&I and give voice to their interests and concerns. We've prioritized training around DE&I at AARP, and they will also have separate initiatives focusing on not only DE&I, but also specifically disparities related to health and finances, and are working along with positions that live across our program, policy, state, local campaigns, and communication function. Again, I also talked about it's important that you have a cross-enterprise individuals and support, and our disparities work is a good example of that. Next slide, please. And so in wrapping up, I'd ask you to ask yourself and your team, what are some ideas, or how can you incorporate these 6 components of DEI into your work? Measurable goals and objectives, executive support, long-term commitment, collective responsibility, allocation of sufficient resources, and age inclusion. These 6 will help you on your path to being a model DEI organization. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Again, I'm delighted with this invitation, always happy to talk with people about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I hope I've answered some of your key questions today. Thank you again for the invitation.